Hello, today is May 23rd, 2018, and this is the kubeadm office hours meeting. I know we had talked informally on Slack about the agenda for today, but why don't we start to go into some of the details here. I'll let Lucas take over.
Cool, yeah. So the first thing, so one of the main priorities for 1.11 is to get the version 1 Alpha 2 API in place, which is a stopgap for our upcoming version 1 Beta 1 API that we most probably need for going to GA later this year. So folks actually can rely on it. For that, it needs to be restructured a bit, because as Fabrizio and others, for example, Liz and Tim have pointed out, in the current API, we don't distinguish what's actually. So we have the blob, the master configuration, where everything that we might possibly need for kubeadm init is, but there's a difference between that, the information that is really used for initialization, like, for example, what is used for node registration, and what is actually something we need later when doing upgrades. So for example, a good example of this is we let the user specify bootstrap tokens in the initialization process, but that shouldn't go into the cluster config map, because that is just a one-off thing you can do in init. So we hence need to split the API from what we have: one for kubeadm init, one struct for kubeadm join, and then inside of the init struct we have another which is more like the cluster spec. If we can get that cluster spec converged with the cluster API, we'll see. But at least we'll do this split, so we have something that is, so everything that is one-offs are in the init configuration and join configuration, or if we still call them master and node configuration, we can debate on that to not break people. But what's needed after cluster init is then in the cluster spec, or whatever we call it. And what's not, like bootstrap tokens, is inside of the init configuration, but not the cluster configuration. So to illustrate what I'm talking about, I'm going to share this doc here. And I'm going to do some screen sharing so I can. So why is this important now? So I just want to get some immediate initial feedback, so we know what steps we can do in this cycle to make the transition easier. So for example, we have a lot of, let me turn on screen sharing. There we go. Can you see my screen? Tim, can you see my screen? Cool. So let's say we have something that is called init configuration and or master configuration. This is what's fed to kubeadm init. We have the normal type meta, things like that. And then we have a new node registration struct, which is shared between init configuration and join configuration. So for this substruct, I already have a PR up. It basically moves the node name field to node registration name, which is going to be it's going to be used in the client cert, common name, and for the node.
Why do you have the name explicit there when you said name is metadata.name field of the API object?
So this
because
is
it's not metadata there. It's explicitly called out.
Yeah. But so we can. I don't think so. So this init configuration, I don't see that having metadata at all, and because this is like the one-off thing. So we just give it the node registration options thing and here. I mean, we could add like, I guess you mean like this, metadata, meta v1 object meta.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean, because that would include name.
Yes, it would. But I don't know, is there anything else we need for this? Because otherwise, I got the feedback from the last cycle or like review cycle that it might be unclear to specify all, because this is not a like normal Kubernetes API object. So anyway, we'll talk more about that later. We see the rest of the thing. So CRI socket has been moved here because that is really a per node thing and used during initialization, both for kubeadm init and join. Labels to be discussed. I don't know whether we need that or not, but that's complicated, more complicated than taints from a auth perspective. So I'm leaving that out right now.
But when we lay it down, we can specify the initial list of labels and taints as part of the initial, args or whatever args that would be specified to the kubelet, because that's one of the most common requests we get, right?
Yeah. So right now so I propose, so the thing is like right now nodes can steer workloads to themselves, which is a disaster from a auth perspective.
I thought they disabled that feature though. I thought
no, it's not.
I thought Jordan, I could swear I saw a PR that Jordan did that once a node.
Yes, but it's not going to be merged. I talked to him like today. It's probably not going to be in for 111. So
merged. Okay.
Yeah, there was one with the taints. That is like pretty much clear. So in the meantime, so these 4 elements, we comment out labels here. These 4 elements and this node registration thing is gonna, I hope, make it in for 111. I think we should do that. We can do this for taints because that is working better from a auth perspective. So a node may register with the taint, any taint, but it can't afterwards. It can't change the taints or patch the taints. So it may register with anything, but not mutate.
Without an operator intervention. Operators.
Yes.
But
like someone with higher privileges than the kubelet itself. Yeah. And if you leave, so by default, this is going to be nil. And if you leave it as nil, it's going to be, when you run kubeadm join, it's going to be defaulted to the master taint. But if you don't want the master taint, you can just leave it out as an empty list. There.
I don't know if that's intuitive, though. Is that intuitive to other people? I want to start soliciting feedback more often.
Yeah.
Just us monologuing. We can't hear you, Fabrice.
We can't hear you, yeah.
And what is node registration?
So it's a common struct. It's going to be a common struct between master configuration that we have now and join registration. That looks something like this: test discovery and node registration. Right now we call these master and node configuration. We might or might not edit that. But I already have a PR up for this to implement these 4 fields. And this would also then, so from an, so I mean, are folks okay with removing the no taint master thing? Because I think it feels really, really special to me. I mean, if we document set taint to an empty list, if you don't want, so then we have the people who added it wanted to do it via the config file. It's still possible using the config file.
Can't we just set a default, like set the default in the initials? Well, if not specified, then it defaults to that thing. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah. So if it's not specified, it's going to be defaulted to the master taint. When running kubeadm init, when you're running kubeadm join, it's not going to be defaulted to anything. So, but you can override this. So, I mean, at least like this is what it is for now. We can take the rest of the comments from PR. I don't want to take up all time. Xrogs is like just pass whatever variable you want to the kubelet as a flag. So that is kind of important to get in.
So one thing to clarify is that once you've specified this, will these arguments and the taints and the other fields and details be propagated to the configuration that is the node registration options? Will they be pushed into the configuration for the kubelet, the config map itself?
No, this is node specific. So these will be as flags because these don't exist in the generic component config of the kubelet. So these will be like more like override. So if you want to override for your master node IP, then you set node IP here and to what you want.
I think having a comment up above on this struct to denote that would actually help a lot. And when you're reading it, especially for first readers, I didn't even get that until I asked the question.
Specific. So this PR is already up. I really want to get this for 1.11. And it's not that of a huge change in. Then we have Bootstrap tokens. So right now we have, it looks like types. So right now we have this in our API. In order to dedupe this, I'm putting it in a substruct. But then when we're doing that, we can as well just put them in a slice. And this is like just for the first. Again, this is only in the first initialization process. We only need this once. And then the Bootstrap token is going to look something like this. Token, TTL usages and groups. You can specify many if you want. This is a stretch for 1.11. I don't know if we're going to get this, but if we do, it's better than we have less work to do for the beta graduation stuff. Does this make sense to everyone?
Yes, I saw 2 thumbs up.
Cool. I don't see you, so yeah. Okay, so then, and yeah, Fabrizio had very valid concerns and wrote up a great long piece on whether we should embed component configs like the kubelets and the kube proxies inside our own API. So far, I've thought we should embed it. But both Mike Thorfen and Fabrizio brought up valid points. So I'm very open to discussing that. I don't think we're going to get to moving those out in 1.11. That's huge, or not huge, but it's a change we don't have time to review and merge at this time. So that is for the next cycle.
What is the alternative option besides moving out? Have some type of reference that points to the actual implementation?
So the other proposal is to take like arguments to a file, like a path to a file. So kubelet config file will point to the component configuration of a kubelet that is generic. When kubeadm loads that, it's going to enforce its own policies, like securing the API endpoint and doing defaulting on that based on like what DNS domain you have set. If you haven't set, so it's going to do the defaulting. So if you haven't set DNS domain in the component config you give it to kubeadm, it's going to default that and set what's in the rest of the cluster spec things. But so exactly as it works today, but just like reference a file instead of embedding. Because, for example, one point that was brought up, like argument is, well, what if the kubelet's component configuration graduates to GA? Then we also have to update our types. And if we have 5 component configs for APIs of a controller manager scheduler, kubelet, and kubeproxy, then it's going to be pretty disruptive. We have to bump our API version all the time. So that is one of the concerns of embedding.
But when a person says get generic configs, this is like a UX concern now, because like we went from like logistical constraints, but then there's a UX constraint. So if I say print defaults, like what is that going to be now if you specified a file, right? You're not going to get all the defaults in the overrides that you would normally see, which is highly useful to be able to see that entire spec of all the overrides.
Yeah, that's the problematic part. Again,
But
I haven't decided.
Sorry, but what about if print defaults prints also defaults for the kubelet config?
Yeah, we'd have to make something like that, I guess. It's going to be a lot of discussion, I think, about how to do this. Anyway, we have these 2 options that I see, at least right now. Either we embed it or we reference it this way. Going further, so if we take a look at the node configuration that I now hear for the proposal called join configuration. Join configuration to an init configuration is more to say, like, this is specific to kubeadm join, and this is specific and should be given to kubeadm init, respectively. Instead of having master and node, which is more generic, that might come later in the life cycle or like be more generally treated. These should be specifically for init and specifically for join, and then contain the more generic parts of the API. So here we have the same object, and then discovery. That is basically all we got. Discovery is divided into 2 parts, bootstrap token or file, with substructs with the options they support. Again, this is like quite a big improvement over this that we have right now, and these down here as well. So that is going to be much more, so you see actually how the parts fit together and so on and so forth.
So my only major concern is just the migration path for existing folks and making sure that we double down on testing apparatus for this, because it's pretty disruptive to make this shift. And so long as that the migration is seamless and we agree upon the end result, then I think that's probably a constraint for the code.
So yeah, I mean, one should be scared of API changes. And that's why I made sure to do a pretty full-blown conversion testing, basically end-to-end in our unit testing. So that merged like last week.
Yeah, but that's pretty simplified in comparison to this, is what I'm saying, right? That it didn't have all the breakdown that you're having here. And some of these changes will be pretty interesting to figure out how to deal with, right?
So it's testing most things. So we like have a sample with a lot of with basically all fields set in the version 1 alpha 1 API, and then we test that when we do the conversions, it's going to result in this kind of version 1 alpha 2 API, and the same for version 1 alpha 2 to version 1 beta 1 or something. So, but yeah, you're right. I mean, the matrix is going to grow, yes.
And we need to be pretty explicit, because one of the things that people commonly do, and I see it all the time, and maybe we should say it explicitly in the upgrade instructions, is that we never skip an upgrade, because people try to do it all the time, but this will clearly destroy them. If you skip an upgrade, you're in a bad place.
Yeah, I made kubeadm upgrade so that it really complains a lot if you try to upgrade multiple versions. I'm not even sure. It might be that you can't force that. In any case, we have it stated clearly when running kubeadm upgrade, but we could state it more clearly in our docs and say, for example, why. And this is why. Another thing I thought about we might want to do, which would be pretty simple code-wise, would be to let the user upgrade their own files. So kubeadm does these conversions seamlessly from version 1 alpha 1 to version 1 alpha 2. We could make like kubeadm config migrate or something that lets you like migrate --config. kubeadm will read this config and print the standard out or whatever, the version 1 alpha 2 equivalent. So that way the user don't have to move all the fields themselves, because that's going to be disruptive. Instead, we can do that automatically. So again, this is also really a stretch. If we could get this discovery stuff in 4.11, I don't think so. etcd, this is already happening. So this is what the etcd struct looks like. This is already implemented, and the PR is, I think a unit test is failing right now when I rebased. But basically, I'm going to update that in 10 minutes after this, and it's virtually LGTM'd already. So that's going to make it for sure. So then we come to...
Do you have a slice of etcds somewhere?
So you mean... So here we have etcd, and there's no slice. So instead, we have local and external. I was thinking about this in the AJ case, and I think... So if we want in the future, we could do something like co-located like cluster, AJ cluster with kubeadm or something. Not that name, absolutely not, but something that would could be transferred easily. So when you transition from the I have only one master to I have two or more, we could do something like this and have like that as a pointer as well. That is mutually exclusive with the others. So if you do kubeadm join -- master or whatever, it's going to transition this and upgrade your config from being one local etcd to multiple etcds.
So where's the usage of the etcd struct? Is in the master config?
Yes.
So why can't the master config just have a slice of these?
Or let me show the rest where this is referenced. So in our init configuration, we specify a cluster. Now I just called it cluster. We could call it cluster configuration or whatever. And we have there this cluster object is serializable, as it has type meta. So this can exist in a file on its own. It has metadata. Probably here, metadata cluster name is going to fit in. Hence, it's like valid to block the PR that I had there on this happening. Then we have, I don't know if we need status, but it's like I want this to actually look like a Kubernetes object, not as a component configuration. That is the rest we have. So most of the fields in master configuration will be transitioned to the cluster spec. So here we have global fields like Kubernetes version, which is essential to kubeadm functionality and upgrade. Here we have the etcd configuration. We have API server, controller manager schedule, networking, the global add-ons. This is if we need it. I don't know if we do. We might. Feature gates that are enabled for this cluster. I haven't thought yet enough on the control plane endpoint stuff, and not on the certificates directory either. But the thing we could do here is like we declare a slice of masters, and whether we put a TD under the master or under the cluster is to be decided, I guess.
I'd prefer it under master, honestly. Or it depends, like if it's local or not, right?
Yeah, it really depends.
If it's local, you'd want, well, each master actually would want the deets. So every master needs the deets. So details. So having it underneath the master actually makes more sense to me than under the cluster.
So the general thing I'm thinking with the control plane components. So the only thing I think we should support is all the masters being identical. That is like the first, I don't know, assumption I think or requirement I think we should make. So for example, if you go here to API server, you can override the image there if you want. Otherwise, it's defaulted from image repository and Kubernetes version. Mm-hmm. You can add extra volumes and extra arguments, and this is just a stopgap for getting component configuration to work, so we can have like just paths to the component configuration, which we then upload to a config map in the cluster. So instead of having the extra args here, it's going to be in a different config map inside of the cluster that we then can mutate as we go.
Can I pause here for a second? Like I'm following you because I've been in this. Do other people, just for clarity, do other people?
Yeah.
Everybody else?
Please do ask.
I'm okay with this change. Check there in detail, but it's part of my comment, so I'm totally okay.
Alexander, Matt?
I'm vaguely following. I'm planning on looking at the actual PRs after this to like really dig in.
This is pretty gonna drastically overhaul how we do configuration, but it's in two phases. One is 111 and the second is 112.
Yeah. So this is like the overall. Now we have to think about like what exactly is this cluster spec gonna look like? Do we support status? Can we get this cluster spec and cluster struct to be identical with the cluster API effort?
I would love
for these to, now as we do this like large disruptive changes, I would love for them to converge.
Yes, especially for 112.
Yes.
So if I don't know where Robert's at, but that in my ideal world scenario, that would be a requirement.
Yes. We'll see if we actually are going to make it a requirement, but I do think that should be the ultimate goal as soon as possible. So something, at least the idea that we have something that is called a cluster with spec and status and metadata. Then we have somewhere a version or multiple versions for different components, whatever. Then we have a list of masters, and inside of this master configuration, we can specify like what is really unique for every master, which is, for example, advertise address, or extra cert sans, or like peer cert sans for etcd, stuff like that. So I really want to keep this master thing as minimal as possible, because that is going to be what is different from this master And we might also want to have a node ref here, like a reference to the node API object this is actually running on, and so on and so forth.
Matt, do you have any comments there, seeing how you wrote that other KEP?
No, I understand like the general concepts, and it's solving what I was attempting to solve before in a much, much better way. I think I need to dig into the details though, just off by myself.
Cool. I would love to have a single slice of masters that had the deets located within that, or it could be appended to as part of the, whenever we execute a new master join.
Yeah, that was one of a good feedback. So I mean, and again, this is like a thought process of like weeks and months, like for me at least, and now we've got great feedback from the SIG in the initial proposal. Now I think it starts to look like something we actually want to support instead of like one mega struct with all kinds of things. And as I look at this cluster spec, it actually starts looking like something the cluster API maybe would want to do. So here again, I try for these control plane stuff structs to be what is identical for all these. Like the API server should have like the same arguments for everyone. The controller manager, you can override some args on like the image, or you can override the scheduler image.
But won't the etcd sans and everything else, and the certs for the etcd peer certs and sans, won't they be different for every single master?
So I'm thinking like if we could put just this is like an idea, but if we could just etcd peer cert san here, then we would have, so when we do create let's say we join a new master, then we check what's the general configuration. It should be, and then we say, oh, it should be local to every master, like co-located. What image should we run? What database should we run? What extract should we have? And then these would be taken from what's actually different per master. But again, I'm not sure we even need to, so this server-side sans could be useful, but it would be great if we could make the etcd just listen on localhost.
If it's local. Yes.
If it's local, yeah. So this all like, yeah, that's the thing. Like we support the local etcd just for that purpose. It is local. And if you don't like that, you can go external over the line, like over the whole line.
There's trade-offs there that are not intuitive to most folks, because this is exactly what we did with OpenShift, and then we had other options available. So there's a trade-off there. We need to be explicit, and I need to write up the details of what that actually means. But because when you use localhost for doing this, you're gonna not have some of the behavior that you would normally have if everything was going over remote socket, and if you didn't have those pure cert sans and everything else specified. So.
Okay, so you basically mean that if you're going from each API server talking to only the local host, it's going to be way different than going from each API server to each publicly available etcd on every master.
Correct. It's a vastly different topology, and it behaves different.
Yeah, cool. I definitely think we could say we support both, or whatever, like if we do really see the need. And then we would go with this. So we put both. Let me actually copy those. Just copy those over here to what is actually different from each master. So something like that, and prepend etcd there. I don't know if anything else is, and then we had node ref here. Meta version object reference.
I just want to pause for a second. I really appreciate you doing it in this fashion, Lucas. I think it's informative and it actually helps me rationalize some of the changes. So I appreciate it.
Cool. Yeah, this is going to be an intense list of changes. But yeah, I hope like at least you see the idea of where we could be going and where I hope we're going with the SIG. I also hope we could do more of these, like API change, whatever. Right now, it has been like me removing a lot of fields from the version 1 alpha 1 API, and the first thing you've noticed is like when I send a PR. So I'm not visioning it should be like that. It should really be this kind of interactive process and like in this fashion. But the ones that are, so yeah, now we basically have to decide what do we think possibly could get into 1.11. So I think the bootstrap token stuff, this is basically already written. And then if I have, so this is all already written, it's about to be merged. And then if I have time and if we have review bandwidth from like, for example, Fabrizio and Tim, I could try to squeeze this in so we don't have to change that later. So does that sound feasible to folks? And then we'll just leave everything, because this is going to heavily, what this cluster spec looks like, it's going to heavily depend on our AJ roadmap, because like how we want to do that. So that is definitely not going to go for 1.11. Are these like 4 or 3 items feasible for folks to even try to get into 1.11 and postpone the rest?
We can try. I need to think through some of the details and implications of what it means. I think we can always put up the PRs and see if it lands. I'll have enough review bandwidth. I don't think that's a problem. I just want to make sure I think through in detail, because sometimes what always happens with these types of changes is we make the change thinking it's all well and good, and then we come across something after the fact. And yeah. I just want to make sure I have enough time to think through, because sometimes you don't think about it until later on, until a user issue hits, and then you're like, oh crap.
Yeah.
You have to patch it.
Yeah. So like
personally,
compared to these, so yeah, please.
The one that really worries a little bit me is the one about the TCD, because we experience so many corner in this ATCD upgrade and ATCD story, and in the ATCD TLS story in the last cycle, that I'm a little bit scared about this one. The other two are just shifting of field. I'm less worried, but this one has so many implications in upgrade that
I kind of agree with that. I agree with Fabrizio there. I would like to make sure that when we do make modifications to etcd in the master, that we've thought through the implications, that we set it up for success for HA, and we do it in like the beginning of the 112 cycle, because there were so many pain points that occurred during upgrade. I can't even describe them all. I know that it might be like a trigger word for both Lee and Jason now at this point. If we were to change it on them, they might be super upset, because there were a lot of edges and a lot of pain points.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Like
for HA, Lucas, for HA, I'm less worried, at least for what we have in roadmap, which is to support only external TCD. If we want to add also the local external TCD, for me it is an additional feature, so it's something that we don't have now explored also in something that is a new feature. Is not designed yet, so it's not a problem now.
So for me, I wasn't here in Q1 when you discussed what's in and what's out for the initial AJ implementation. But I do think that the setting up etcd in AJ mode is going to be, whether we co-locate or in some way co-locate with the masters, how we talk to etcd from the API service, doesn't matter in this case. But I do think kubeadm init / kubeadm join setting up AJ etcd is going to be one of the most appreciated, but also for us hard changes or features to add. But for us to actually say we can support AJ, that might be one of the most crucial. Getting people to create a load balancer in front of the kubelets for the masters is probably a less troublesome feature or requirement for them. But setting up external etcd is going to be hard. And what I'm basically trying to say is, I think we should try to get into okay, we do support setting up AJ etcd together with kubeadm. I really want to get that into our API. Otherwise, I think we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot.
I think it's not a requirement for the I think what the conversation piece was is it's not a requirement for the master join workflow now to get it unblocked, to get feedback on it. But in an ideal world, I definitely agree that we will have cycles. Like Heptio will fully resource getting etcd, local etcd up to snuff, hopefully in the 112 cycle.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So now I more maybe understand what Fabrizio was saying. So for the initial kubeadm join -- master thing, we will not consider external etcd. But what I was saying was, I think we really have to act as we supported AJ etcd in our cluster spec when we're designing that. Also, when thinking about can we get this to converge with the cluster API, which is definitely going to need AJ etcd represented in a config in some way.
Yeah, and that's the way Google deploys. So if we want to get, my whole goal is to get Google to deploy cluster API and kubeadm as the canonical source of reference.
Yeah.
And everyone uses the same thing.
Yeah, that is my goal as well. You were about to say something because...
Yes. If there is a friction between kubeadmin API and cluster API, because cluster API was designed to be totally flexible, so that means that behind you can use kubeadmin or whatever you want for bootstrapping a cluster. While in kubeadmin API, we are forced to do some decision. And this will be the major point of friction, I guess, with the people who designed the cluster API. I think that we have to open a table as soon as possible to discuss with Robert and Chris, and I don't know who's in charge of the cluster API now.
I just back-channeled with Chris 10 seconds ago, so she knows what we want to do this.
I think so. To address your concern, Fabrizio, I think that, so still, even though we made the API versions the same, or the API struct the same for the cluster spec and things, you don't have to use kubeadmin to implement the cluster API. But if you want to use kubeadmin, you can just the exact config you generated as a canonical source of truth, you can just feed that in kubeadm and it works. That is more the thing we're looking at. So you can use it for whatever deployment tool, like say you want to create a GKE or EKS cluster or AKS. Then you feed the same cluster spec to them, and they have converters to like translate that into actual calls to the cloud provider. In the same way as you can feed that to kubeadm, and it will create on your whatever bare metal node, it will just work, and they talk the same language. That is the ultimate goal of this, I think. You don't have to use kubeadmin, but if you want to do that with the cluster API, it works seamlessly.
I want to do that.
I totally agree. Yeah, yes, I mean 100%, and I think that with this release of the API we are shaping, the gap is really narrow now. So we are one step to the goal.
So I think the consensus here from the feedback from Fabrizio and myself was that like we are totally fine with the other changes, sans the etcd changes for 111, and maybe it would give us a little more time to think about the etcd changes for 112 to try to align what we want to do.
How about another? Yeah, I forgot that. So one other thing that could be or not. Yeah, well, scratch that. So this is what it currently looks like. I hope to restructure these, remove this one, notent master, refactor or put CRI second node name in the same place. I've already removed cloud provider, as you can use API server extra args instead, and the kubelet extra args thing. And kubelet configuration is still going to be there until we settle on whether to pass a file or embed. Privileges pod is gone. The same thing, it was like a weird, or it was like a thing that was only needed for the OpenStack cloud in-tree cloud provider. But now OpenStack has transitioned to using the out-of-tree cloud provider, so this is not needed anymore. So hence I removed that as well. Image pull policy is not needed now that we have Chuck's work on kubeadm config images pull, and also doing that pre-flight. I'm not going to be able to remove this one quite yet, because it needs like being able to specify the images separately. But that's for the next thing. And then doing the, so etcd is on its way to be refactored. Self-hosted etcd, this was added just to support self-hosting with etcd, with an idea we then scratched at KubeCon Austin. So we never used these types internally. We just added them and had a follow-up to start implementing, but we never merged the implementation PR. So these...
I'm totally cool. Kill them.
Yeah, so these are gone already. And then refactoring the node configuration is still to be done. But that is basically what it currently looks like. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff. But I interpret the feedback here is to like summarize. Okay, to proceed with this, getting it into 111. Okay, to proceed with this if we have time. This is about to be merged, which is just splitting up the megastruct into two. Whether we do change something in local etcd or like to support the AJ thing is to be discussed later. But as is, just as this field move, it's okay by now. Discovery, we can do that if we have time, and if Tim basically and other folks can think of all the edge cases we might hit. But I think this should be relatively straightforward as well, as this is mostly about renaming the fields. But for sure, we might hit something. that is the like status update, I guess, from the API changes that are about to be made.
That's great. I love it. Thanks for jumping on this hand grenade, Lucas. This was the biggest problem we kind of ran into with it's like we ran into a brick wall.
Yeah.
On the configuration, we when we jumped into 110, this is the first thing that we ran into.
Yeah, sorry guys, I just jumped on. Lucas, were you demonstrating what you did to fix the config deserialization?
Oh, I can talk about that as it's. I didn't mention it. So yeah, here we have. So Lee's question was, how do we do? So we have a file on disk. It might have like no type metaset. It might have the wrong faulty proxy stuff that broke us in 110. Like basically feature gates where before in 1.9 it was a string, and now it was converted into a map, string map. And we have to support all those cases. So we have to support loading a faulty 1/1. We have to support loading an OK 1/1, and we have to support loading a 1/2. So this is what it looks like. So we take a path to a configuration file and a defaulted config. So in this case, in kubeadm init, the flags have been defaulting the config, setting some basic structure on it. But if we do specify the config, it's gonna override everything. That's why we can't specify both flags and config. Them usually both normal config changing flags and config. They're mutually exclusive. So if CFG path is defined, we're reading the file and calling bytes to internal config. If we didn't specify a config, it's going to default the configuration from the flags. It's going to convert them to the internal version. These are equivalent, really the same thing. This is like version 1/2 and the internal version are the same. And then call default and validate. So to answer Lee's question, what we do in getting this byte array to an internal config, there's a couple of things we have to do. We have to first load the YAML here. So this basically calls something that Liz wrote, which was great. Let me see if I find that here. Small wrapper around GoYAML that basically just deserializes the bytes into a map string interface type. That means then when we have the map of string interface, we can check, for example, we can see is kind defined or is API version defined. If they aren't, we're gonna add that in and treat this as version 1/1. Ever after since, we're enforcing type meta being set.
Lucas, a quick question. Is this bytes to internal config also called for the reading of the config from the cluster config map?
Yes, it's always called.
Cool, thank you.
And then we check, is it version 1 or version 2? And if it's 1, we have to do this migrate stuff, which is exactly doing this thing. This was also a thing Liz wrote to mitigate the problem. So this basically runs this feature gate part and translating this string into a map. And this is a bit complicated, but it works. And this is then called here if we are trying to serialize version 1 alpha 1.
We have to, was that conversion from the already implemented conversion in the proxy API, in the proxy config?
So this migrate stuff fixes the problem with the on a like, we have a map string interface, and if that is faulty, we're fixing it.
I'm curious if that conversion code is our code in kubeadm, or if it's like the proxy config code.
This is our code.
Interesting.
For better.
So
I just want to give a heads up that we've reached time, and the cluster API folks are starting to show up. So I think we should respect the fact that we have a single meeting location.
Yeah. So, but yeah, everything's in this util config, and we can remove a lot of the exceptions here in the next version. But right now it works seamlessly, and we have end-to-end unit tests for this. That's all, I guess.
Right. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to stop recording now.